Hello and welcome. Today we're continuing our new unit on distributive justice. This question about who owns what distributions of resources should we look for in a just society. Last time around we looked at Locke's theory of property rights, which said that property is a natural right that emerges from mixing your labor with unowned things from the commons. Today we're going to be looking at a competing theory, Hume's theory of property and justice. So what I want to do today is explain how Hume thinks we develop a sense of justice, and as a subcategory of justice, property. We'll learn about Hume's theory of conventions, and then we'll see why Hume thinks that why the motive to act justly is not a natural virtue, as he puts it. And he would also say that there is no natural right to justice that emerges in the state of nature. And he's also going to say, and this is going to be against Hobbes, justice is not part of a social contract, nor are property rights. So, without any further ado, what are we talking about when we talk about property rights? Well, Hume is going to tell us that property rights are a matter of convention rather than nature. And in other words, he's going to say, the fact that this coffee mug belongs to me is not something that's like a natural right, like my, right to health and happiness and bodily integrity, we might say, could be seen as a natural right. But it's a conventional right. It's a right that emerges due to the fact that we have mutually adopted certain social rules. Now, Hume gives us a number of examples of justice. The word justice for Hume doesn't mean something like retributive justice, but instead he's thinking of cases like repaying a loan or keeping a promise or forbearing to take the property of others. So we might think of what Hume has in mind when he's thinking about justice is this practice of self-restraint that we do in the context of society. And he's going to say that one great example of self-restraint in society is going to be the invention of property. So Hume, by saying that justice isn't something that just emerges naturally in any kind of context, he's going to say there are certain circumstances in which justice emerges. So he's going to say that in some ways that society is, or in some context that human beings might be in, the concepts of justice, restraining yourself, and property, having exclusive entitlement to use and control certain items, these rules would not make any sense. So for instance, he has us imagine a situation of great plenty, a so-called golden age, right? And you can imagine in the golden age, all food is plentiful, right? So when we have all of our goods and all of our needs easily met, we might say that the distance between what is mine and what is yours barely matters. You could just walk up to a tree and pick some fruit and, find something good to eat, find some good shelter, get enough water, and it's all just sitting there in front of you because you are in, this hypothetical golden age. It's basically a sort of Garden of Eden where you have everything that you need, you can get it with little to no effort. And in those kinds of situations, we don't have to divide stuff up, right? We don't have to mark things as mine because as soon as one thing is taken, there's still another left for you. Hume is also going to say that self-restraint doesn't make a lot of sense in a time of great scarcity. So he's going to say, if there aren't enough resources to go around, restraining yourself doesn't make a lot of sense anymore. In fact, the best thing that you can do to protect your interests is get what you can without asking and do everything you can protect yourself. In Hume's second enquiry concerning morals, which is sort of an update of what he wrote in the treatise. He says that in these situations of great scarcity, we would have no problem with starving people opening up granaries to get the food that they need. And in this way, we might say that property rights are suspended when property rights are going to kill you rather than protect you, right? So in circumstances of both great plenty and great scarcity, the idea of property doesn't make any sense. Now, in this situation, Hume is going to say, well, what is the actual human predicament? He's going to say, we're not in the Garden of Eden, we're not in a golden age, so we don't have everything that we need easily, but we're also not usually in a situation of extreme scarcity or something like a Hobbesian hellscape, right? The situation that we're usually in is that there is enough to go around, but only with collaboration, cooperation, and some effort. So we might say that we're in a middle situation between great plenty and great scarcity. We are in a situation of what we might call like moderate access to goods. So that's the first situation that Hume sees. There might be enough to go around, but only if we put some attention and effort towards the problem. Hume also thinks about how justice relates to human nature. So he says that if people had extreme benevolence, and I think that when we're thinking about extreme benevolence, we might be thinking about this godlike ability to not just love your family and your neighbors, but any person, even on the other side of the world. And Hume suggests that if there was extreme benevolence and we had great affection for everybody, we wouldn't need contracts or promises or property. We would just be motivated from our own hearts to look out for others, right? But the fact of the matter is, this isn't how people are built. We don't care as much about the well-being of strangers as we do about ourselves or your family, right? And in this situation, Hume observes, for instance, that like in a family, within a married couple, you don't typically have to have clear delineations of property rights. Of course, in Hume's time, property would just all go to the male in a marriage partnership. But the more important point is that within a family household, there are many items which we don't consider to be mine and thine. It's not like you have to like mark things in the fridge as yours or your spouse's. Rather, you just have milk in the fridge and anybody can drink it whenever they feel like it. Right? So there isn't a division of mine and thine in situations of great affection between each other. So Hume says like we aren't living in a situation like that with the rest of society. This is part of why we need conventions of sharing and cooperation and restraint. In a similar situation, Hume, even though he acknowledges that people can have partiality and can be a bit selfish, he's also going to disagree with Hobbes, right? He's going to say that we aren't completely selfish, right? So we have rules of justice that work, but he points out that if we were in Hobbes' state of nature, and if each individual was truly concerned only with advancing their own well-being, this is that thesis of psychological egoism, that the only thing that we ever do is things that will promote our own self-interest. Well, Hume doesn't quite think that either. And again, we can think back to the example of the family. We notice that when you love somebody and when somebody is of your kin, you might put as much of your effort into making them happy rather than yourself, right? And in this way, even though Hume does acknowledge that there is such thing as human selfishness, we aren't completely selfish. Now, this is an interesting predicament, right? So we're in a middle state between great plenty and great scarcity. We're also in a middle state between great benevolence and great selfishness, right? We might say that we are with medium access to resources, and we are in a medium between benevolence and selfishness. And so Hume says that it's actually the situation that we're in, where we can get goods, but only if we cooperate, and if we are selfish, but not completely selfish, those are the sorts of situations in which we will actually see the point of cooperating, right? Because Hume says basically, we will adopt strategies of self-restraint when we can recognize the way in which those strategies of self-restraint will serve our interests. So this leads us to the recognition of what serves our interests and the creation of what Hume calls a convention. So a convention, for Hume, is an activity made possible by a group's adoption of a shared rule for acting. So we figure out, how are we going to solve this problem? And we decide we will each do this. And then, by having everybody adopt a shared rule, everybody's going to get the benefit that they aim to achieve. Now, think about this one. Here in America, I'm here in North Carolina, right? Everybody drives on the right side of the road. Now, if you're in Australia or England, of course, you're doing it the opposite way, right? You're going to drive on the left side of the road. Now, one interesting thing is that by having a functional system of drivers and driving, what we do is we have found a way to adopt a rule that everybody's going to act on, and it will serve our interests, right? We will get to the other side of a road, or we will get to our destinations, We'll get to our destination safely and in a way that's predictable. And in that way, we can say that we've adopted a shared rule and it serves our purposes. Now, we'll notice that you don't necessarily have to adopt the rule, drive on the right. You could be like the English or the Australians and drive on the left, right? Hume also gives an example of two people rowing the oars of a boat in unison. So they are trying to get to the other side of a lake. And the way that Hume is imagining this example, maybe they each get into the boat, they look over at one another, and maybe they count off 1, 2, 3, and they just start stroking the oars of the boat in unison. Right? Now, in this way, Hume says that we could think about property rights as a similar kind of convention. So you might have an urge to take certain material goods, I don't know, like the wood stacked up in your neighbor's yard, or the bike that you see, sitting in your other neighbor's yard, right? But the thought is, if you resist your urge to take others' material goods, and if we all adopt the convention, you can also expect them to leave your goods alone. And in fact, you have more security of your goods, and you can meet your material needs in a much easier way when we all adopt the convention. So that makes everybody better off. Now, here's an interesting thing. Hume will tell us that a convention is not based on a promise. A couple reasons for this. For one thing, he's going to say that in the example of these two men rowing a boat, pulling the oars in unison, they don't necessarily have to say much of anything to one another, right? But they have an understanding of what they will do together and how that will solve their needs. And that's all you need for a convention, right? Adopt a rule, secure a benefit, right? But you don't have to verbally say, I hereby promise to row the oars of the boat with you. So one reason that Hume doesn't think that a convention is like a promise or a contract or an agreement is the fact that we can find many cases of people acting according to what he's calling a convention that doesn't require promise. Another good example, and I think that this is really interesting, Hume will even say that human language is a convention. right? So the fact that in the English language convention, my using the letters D-O-G or to utter the words dog, and that by doing so I'm referring to, canine, fluffy, four-legged friends with wagging tails and wet noses, right? We can meet a need, right? By adopting very many of these linguistic conventions, we can get our thoughts across to one another, and we can all be made better off in the process. Now, in this way, we're going to say that conventions are all over the place for Hume. Now, in this way, because we have a convention-based explanation of justice and property rights, Hume is also going to say that nature, and he might say that this is the way that people are and what we value prior to and independent of conventions, he's going to say that can't explain our concern for justice. Because he says many of our natural impulses lead toward the breakup of society, and he's going to point to things like self-love, our desire for many goods, and certain natural moral impulses. So he's going to say, for instance, that it is a bit of moral motivation that you place extra special care on your near and dear. Say, the resources and time and effort you take towards caring for a baby that you have, right? And he says that, again, if we cared about everybody in society as much as our own children, for one thing, Hume says that that's so far out of the norm, we would probably blame a person for caring about strangers as much as their own children. But he's more importantly pointing out that it would just be unnecessary to have rules of justice if you were motivated to make sure that the needs of everybody were met in the first place. But it's when we engage in certain practices of cooperation, and those practices of cooperation for Hume might start within the family, and then they might move out to neighbors, and then a village, and then a larger city, we will recognize the value of preserving conventions. And in this way, Hume's going to note, we have never truly lived in Hobbes' state of nature because we have these natural impulses to care for those who are near and dear to us, right? And in that way, we're always engaging in practices of cooperation and mutual help with one another. And in this way, we're also arguing against Hobbes because Hume is saying that in human nature, psychological egoism doesn't really describe how we're motivated. There are things other than our own personal well-being that can bring us to act. So in this way, we have self-interest for Hume, but it's not as narrow as Hobbes would have it. But here's how we develop a sense of justice. He says, after men have found by experience that their selfishness and confined generosity acting at liberty, so this is the do what you feel like, look out for number one. He says, this strategy totally incapacitates you for society. You won't make many friends with your neighbors if you act like this. And at the same time, you observe that society is necessary to the satisfaction of those original self-interested passions. They are naturally induced to lay themselves under restraint of rules. So in this way, even though he's talking about property as an artificial virtue rather than a natural virtue, he's going to say that there is something in human nature that makes us convention-forming creatures, right? So we come under the strain of rules, and those render your commerce more safe and commodious. And to the imposition then and observation of all these observance of these rules, both in general and in every particular instance, they are first moved only by a regard to self-interest, and this motive at the first formation of society is sufficiently strong and forcible. So he's going to say that simply using your ability to recognize how to best serve your self-interest, you will develop concepts of cooperation, justice, and property. So the big point is that we live together in society because we know what's good for us, and we can practice mutual restraint in pursuing our desires. Now, that point is Hobbesian almost, but Hume will also note that because we are establishing our rules of justice merely by interest, he's going to say that we see the value of cooperation just in the way that it promotes our interests, right? And in this way, the adoption of shared rules to promote our interests explain why they're good and why we should follow them. So where many others will say that it's mutual agreement or signing of some social contract that creates our obligations, Hume's not going to say that, right? He's going to say that the mutual agreement is after the fact and not explaining what's important. So against Hobbes, he's going to say that our concern for justice is not a matter of a social contract. So Hume is not a social contract theorist, even though he's interested in this idea of cooperation and mutual restraint within a society. So we'll just recap. Against Hobbes, Hume thinks that we never had to get out of the state of nature in the first place. He says basically it never existed. And probably if we were in the state of nature, that would be that state of great selfishness and great scarcity. We'd probably never be able to get out of it. And in this way, Hume is also very mindful of the idea that Hobbes overrated human selfishness. He says that we actually do have genuine concern for others. But against Locke, he's going to say that we don't have to appeal to a natural right of property to make sense of why we care about it, right? So Hume's going to say that just by gathering goods in the state of nature, the notion of property doesn't apply yet. It's only once we have functioning conventions that can explain what property is and why it matters. And in this way, we might think of Hume as taking a rather pragmatic, consequentialist approach to property and justice, rather than making claims like Locke did, that we have these things called inalienable natural rights that exist independent of society or the state or how others are behaving around us. So that's it for this time. I hope that you found some interesting contrast between the Humean theory of property versus other competing theories like the social contract theory that we find in Hobbes, or like Locke's natural rights theory of property. But we'll wrap up there. Next week, we will get yet another perspective on property rights through Karl Marx, reading an interesting piece of his called Value, Price, and Profit. So, thanks for listening, and take care.